Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin McCarthy, the director of Perrot Memorial Library. We are pleased to welcome you to this evening's discussion featuring the Binney Park Advisory Committee. And before we get underway, a brief announcement. If you have not heard, the libraries are now open in the town of Greenwich, including Perrot. We are open for people to come in and browse the collections Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. We will continue to offer our curbside contact-free pickup service on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings and on the weekends. For further details, I invite you to go to our webpage at www.perrotlibrary.org. Thank you for that brief message, and it's my pleasure to introduce a person from our co-sponsoring organization tonight. That is the Garden Club of Old Greenwich, Martina Doshin.
Thank you, Kevin. And this evening, instead of me making the introductions, I have asked Lynne Davenport to first thank the library for our collaboration and to then introduce our speakers, because Lynne is also part of the Binney Park Advisory Committee, and so she knows the speakers very well. So Lynne, take it away. Lynne, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Got it. Okay. Can you hear me? I'm all set. To begin, I'd like to thank Kevin McCarthy for working with the Garden Club of Old Greenwich and presenting 3 programs during this COVID restrictive year that we've dealt with. And we've been dealing with aspects of nature and the environment in Greenwich. The first 2 programs were presented by Joanne Messina from the Greenwich Tree Conservancy and Dr. Greg Kramer, Superintendent of Parks and Trees and also the tree warden. Our final program for this year will be a presentation on the work that has been done at Binney Park over the years, over the past several years, and will be led by Nancy Chapin and Pete Uhry, who are co-chairs of the Binney Park Advisory Committee. Nancy Chapin is a lifelong resident of Coscob who attended the Greenwich Public Schools. She's been very involved in community activities throughout her life and was no doubt inspired by her parents. Her mother founded the Greenwich Pony Club at their home in Coscob, and her father started the North Mianus Cowboys youth football program. As a youngster growing up in Greenwich, Nancy was able to take advantage of all the recreational activities that the town has to offer: swimming at the beach, hiking and visiting the various parks in town, playing tennis and sailing, to mention only a few. Thus, her appreciation of the town continued to increase. As an adult, she developed a strong interest in improving our parks and ensuring that they are maintained according to conservation principles. Nancy, among her many activities, Nancy's a former member of the Conservation Commission and served as a liaison to the Board of Parks and Rec. During that time, she mentored over 6 Eagle Scout programs or projects at Montgomery Pinetone, the Tuckman and Pomerantz parks. She also co-chaired the Conservation Commission's Park Challenge, which promoted conservation efforts and passive recreation activities in town. In addition to serving on this commission, Nancy has also been a District 8 RTM member, served on the PTA Council, the Garden Education Center, which is now the Greenwich Botanical Center, and as a board member of the Greenwich Riding and Trails Association. She currently serves as co-chair of the Binney Park Advisory Committee, and which was a committee that was formed in 2019 to implement the recommendations that were part of the master plan for Binney Park, which was created by Martha Lyons, a landscape architect, back in 2015. And she was hired by the town to come up with these plans. And Nancy is also a member of the Board of Parks and Rec. Moving on, I've known Pete Uhry for about 10 years now when we began working together on the Village Improvement Committee. This is an ad hoc committee that was formed of interested Old Greenwich residents after the tree hearing dealing with a merchant's request to remove the columnar oak trees along Sound Beach Avenue. Once the trees were removed, Pete devoted much of his time and effort working with the town, local merchants, and the Garden Club of Old Greenwich to enhance the appearance of the village through the planting of sidewalk gardens along Sound Beach Avenue. Pete and his family moved to Old Greenwich in 1972 and lived here for 42 years and then moved to Riverside after Superstorm Sandy. In my mind, I think of Pete Uhry as Mr. Old Greenwich because of his long-term love and concern for all aspects of Old Greenwich life. He was a member of the board of the Old Greenwich Association for 25 years and served as president on 3 different occasions. Once he moved to Riverside, he joined the Riverside Association. He was a member of the Greenwich Audubon and served as a 2-time president for this organization. He's had a long-standing interest in the appearance of Binney Park as well. In 2005, he began working with Bruce Spayman, the former superintendent of Parks and Trees. His work included rebuilding the loop trail in the Hillside Annex and taking a leadership role in putting holiday lights up in the park once the new lighting fixtures were installed. In 2009, he initiated the daffodil planting in the north end of the park and on the hillside overlooking Perrot Library, in conjunction with Greenwich Green and Clean and help from many members of the Garden Club. Over the years, I didn't realize this since I started working on this. Over the years, it's estimated that more than 8,000 bulbs have been planted there. And I hope that everybody has had a chance to see those daffodils this year, because I think they are absolutely spectacular. I think it's the best display that we've had. Pete began working on the Binney Park Master Plan Committee in 2015, and then in 2019, he became co-chair of the Binney Park Advisory Committee, along with Nancy. He's continuing his interest in the town's parks by working on improvements for the Pomerantz, Tuckman, and Montgomery Pinetone woodlands. He's a member of the board of Greenwich Green and Clean, as well as being a longtime member of the Retired Men's Association, where he's also served as president. To recognize Pete's many contributions to Old Greenwich, in 2013, the Garden Club of Old Greenwich awarded him the Alan F. Kitchell Conservation Trophy for outstanding work in conservation. Thus, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Nancy and Pete to you. With their inspiration, hard work, and dedication, Binney Park would not look the way it does today with all its new improvements. So that's the end of my conclusion, but I do have one request. Before they begin their presentation, if you have any questions about the presentation, please write them in the chat room at the bottom of your screen. They will be considered at the end of the program. And now to Nancy and Pete. Thank you.
I'm the one who's going to start this evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thanks for joining us this evening to participate in a discussion of what, why, and how it turned out that we had a Binney Park Advisory Committee. We put together a PowerPoint presentation for you. And we also, I just want to say one other thing too, while they're getting that sort of organized and getting the slideshow going. I love the fact that the library has done this, and I think it's great that the participants include the Garden Club of Old Greenwich. And I hope that sometime in the future that programs like this will be done for both of those organizations, simply because they've contributed so much to the community over the years. So let's get started with I'm being interrupted by my wife.
We're keeping it real.
Yes, absolutely.
I was downstairs and your
I want to make sure the screen sharing is working. So do we have the first slide up for everybody to see the Binney Park Advisory Committee? What I have? Yep. Okay.
Looks great.
All right, Pete, take it away.
I'm sorry, my wife was saying that she was downstairs watching this and she wasn't exactly hearing something. So anyway, so let's get started. First of all, let's talk a little bit about open space parks. What Nancy and I learned and what the committee learned, and which many of you may know simply because you work with open space or are gardeners, is that gardens are ever in flux, ever evolving, ever changing, and you have to keep up with them, which means that individuals and groups just have to keep a monitoring activity going. And that was certainly true with Binney Park. There are two groups that really sort of look after Binney Park. There's a staff. They have an office and a work shed down the south end of the park and have been involved in the maintenance of the park, probably since 1930 or 33. And then there are also groups like outsiders or individuals who will step forward when they see an opportunity to make improvements in a park. And then that's exactly what happened when Mr. Binney and his family decided that rather than having houses on the land for Binney Park, we ought to have public space dedicated to recreation. And that's the view you're seeing behind me. Nancy, maybe we can go to a second slide here. The Binneys had come to Sound Beach, as Old Greenwich was known, in the late 1800s. And Mr. Binney was a successful businessman manufacturing charcoal and lampblack and other products related to carbon. But his real breakthrough product came in 1903 when he invented and started marketing the Crayola crayons. And they're still being used and enjoyed by many people today. And that perhaps is one of the legacies of that. I think it's great fun that the family and that product was invented by someone who was living in Old Greenwich. So here we are. 10 acres was in the initial purchase, and that was in 1927. And Mr. Binney used the talents of both the Crescetti family, who were later known for their nursery up on the Post Road, and his son-in-law, who was James A.G. Davy, who later founded the Davy Tree Company, as advisors for landscaping. So a lot of landscaping was done, and this picture from the 1940s shows a not fully mature, but at least a park under development. So if we look then at that initial parcel of 10 acres, think of it north of Wescom Wood Road, which was built in 1930, by the way. For 6 years, Mr. Binney and staff spent inordinate amounts of time and close to $100,000, so it's reported, on developing this northern end of the park. When the southern end was purchased and the playing fields were made, that came a little bit later, but in terms, both of these lands were low-lying swampy areas, and so it was a good deal of work. The dredging that came from the pond was used in the building up the property down on the south end. 3 other parcels then were added. We've already talked about the one in the north end where the pond is. We've talked about the one to the south of that, which is more active recreation uses. But the other 3 are worth mentioning, and they followed because other members of the Binney family stepped up and saw a need and suggested that that be done. Mr. Binney himself passed away in 1934. The first parcel that was added some years later was the Helen Binney Kitchell Natural Park. This is 10 acres of land, woodland, by the way, which virtually has not been touched in some 85 years. And it's sitting right in the middle of Old Greenwich. It's an extraordinary asset for our community. interesting, and I'll refer to a survey that was done in 2005. When a survey was done of everyone in Old Greenwich, all the households in Old Greenwich, only 18 people said, 18% of the respondents said they had ever been into the Helen Binney Kitchell Natural Park. The next unit over on the left was the Hillside Annex, and that was purchased as, it's a hillside, it's where the daffodils are today. And it was really purchased to create a visual buffer against housing, which is, if you see where the pointer is, there's houses up there. And so the idea was to have a view that really sort of looked like a park view. And then again, because of a specific reason, the reading room was added as the last of the 5 parcels. And why that? Because someone wanted to put a filling station, as we refer to it, a gas station today, on that property. And so these 5 things came together thanks to the members of the Binney family over a long period of time. Now, if we move forward in time and talk about the next 50 years or so, the park is used for active recreation. The visual that we had shown you just previously was 1940. You'll see that tennis courts were added, and they were added quite early actually, and 2 ball fields were added. That was fine. And down in the lower left-hand corner where it says pavilion, a playground was placed in there, and swings were also available in the north end. I read recently that a skating rink was actually built, and perhaps the park department might want to consider doing that again. When the pond was dredged, I should note, by the way, Mr. Binney demanded that it not be dredged in any kind of deep way. Should someone fall through the ice, he didn't want them to get into trouble and drown. So here we are, we have a park, and if we move in our thinking forward to about 1990, 1980, we have a park that's mature, and then go back to my thought about a park ever changing, ever evolving. And during all this time, by the way, the town took on the responsibility of maintaining the park, which they did, but no major changes that we can really refer to were made. The buildings were in place. If Nancy were to use the pointer again, in the middle of the pond is something called a pavilion, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. There was a clubhouse with restrooms down in the south end. And so in the middle 80s, a gentleman by the name of Bill Rutherford Sr. developed, he was a local landscape designer, worked out of Old Greenwich, dedicated to the community, and he developed a plan for the revitalization of Binney Park. And he drew in a friends group, and the friends group was primarily comprised of the Garden Club of Old Greenwich and Riverside, as well as the Homeowners Association, the Riverside Association, and the Old Greenwich Association. All these groups were trying to work together, and yet nothing really sort of got accomplished for 2 key reasons. The first being that there wasn't significant funding for the opportunity, and then secondly, there was distractions in the park department, which prompted no great amount of money to do any significant change to come through. So what happened next? Well, this, by the way, is one of my favorite pictures of Binney Park. It was taken in 2005, and I think it's worth showing because even though I was commenting that not an awful lot had been done to Binney Park, look how beautiful it is. Binney Park has extraordinary bones. It was an award winner when it was first built, and it continues even when it needs attention to be rewarding to anybody who is able to get into it and do that. Volunteer groups kept coming forward. Nancy will talk about that in a minute, but I will mention a survey that was done in 2005 by the Old Greenwich Association. They sent 2,800 mailings to every household in zip code 06870 with the intent of finding out what people wanted to have done in terms of developing or changing Binney Park. The first thing and most important thing on everybody's mind, to the tune of 80%, said, control the geese. And controlling the geese is what happened. And we do not seem to have that problem today, happily. The second thing, but way, way down the line, with about a 30% response and recommendation, was to add more color and flowers and plants to the park. And it's taken a bit of time for that to happen. And we'll show you where it has happened thanks to the current administration in the Parks Department and a lot of volunteer work. So here we are in 2005, and some spurs then are underway to have change made in the park. Bruce Spayman was in place, and so I'm going to let Nancy sort of take the reins of the meeting for a few minutes and tell us what happened sort of next.
Okay, we'll give Pete a break. That was a great historical perspective. So 2005, what next? As Pete touched on, the park had great bones, but Parks Department had limited resources. Yet things were getting done. Scouts stepped up. Here's a picture of an Eagle Scout project, actually along the Helen Binney Kitchell Park. Volunteers stepped up, support groups, garden clubs, but still the work in Binney Park was not a lot. Again, as Pete mentioned, resources weren't dedicated there. But here's a great day. It's many of you will recognize Mary Hull. This was a volunteer project. You can see we're kind of near the intersection of Sound Beach Avenue, Perrot Library, somewhere in the back there. And it was a cleanup project. Great volunteer partnership with a law firm, Day Pitney. Inspirational in that sponsor group stepped up. And you'll hear later on, there are always opportunities for people that want to jump in and do this. But Pete, is there anything you want to add to this day? It was a great volunteer day. Great people came in. I know you were there.
I would simply say that we are talking today and in our conversations about developing things of public-private partnerships. This Day Pitney planting day, which is what they are doing, they're putting in bulbs, was something that was coordinated by Greenwich Green and Clean, which is fortunate to have a significant amount of equipment to lend to groups like this. But this is a whole bunch of lawyers and staff in the Greenwich office who came out and spent the day doing a planting as a volunteer activity to help the community.
What next? So that was in 2005, and in 2009, the then Superintendent of Parks and Trees, Bruce Spayman, recognized that we have these fabulous parks, historic parks, and something should be done about them. So his first step was to get out an RFP for historic landscape report. And this report, I just want to mention, you can find on the town website. If you go to the Parks and Rec link, you will find these reports. There's one for the 5 parks in town: Bruce Park, Binney Park, Byron Park, and Montgomery Pine Needham. And they basically took a lot of information. They went to the Historic Society, they spoke to residents. Martha Lyon really did her legwork. And Pete, I'm gonna let you talk a little bit more about the steps about how these came to be, particularly as it came to Binney, because I know that there were a lot of interviews done with local residents with local knowledge.
I should first mention that Martha is a professional focused specifically on the restoration of parklands. She lives in Massachusetts, has done work in Gloucester and up in Portland, Maine. And we were lucky to get her to come down. She's a true professional and did a lot of homework and asked a lot of questions and got a lot of information. So the whole community gained a better understanding of their parklands as a consequence of Martha's work.
So here, what you see is, again, so we had this historic landscape report, but still no management plan. It was just a report that had reflected on the history of the park. So what was happening in the park? Volunteers had stepped forward, and I'm gonna let Pete talk about this, but the garden clubs, the Riverside Association, they were starting to take an interest in this beloved park. So Pete, why don't you talk about these two photos and what happened here?
Well, this is a classic example of what happens over a period of time. In the left photograph, there was a set of stairs coming down that hillside, and there was a loop trail that went off to the right and left. And it goes up to the tops of those rocks. And at one time, there was actually an electric light on top of that hill. Bruce Spayman and I were up there walking along one day. He said, you know something? He said, look up this pole above me right here. I'm paying $12 a month for the electricity for this light that's sitting up here, and I don't even know why it's there. So it's the kind of thing that we are talked about a little bit before, and is so important when we're talking about parks, and they do change. The Riverside Association got behind the rebuilding of these steps because the Hillside Annex is the only part of Binney Park that's in Riverside. And by golly, they wanted to do something that sort of acknowledged their part ownership, quote unquote, to the park. So that's why we have that set of stairs there, and another one which you'll see in a few minutes.
Okay, here we are, 2009, Daffodil Hill. So Pete had this brilliant idea, wild idea, that we're all aware of the Crocus Hill in Greenwich, that by golly, Old Greenwich should have something spectacular. And those who know Pete, he has strong opinions, and he thought, well, crocuses are sort of wimpy, let's go strong. So he came up with this idea of a Daffodil Hill. And you'll see here, this is a great before shot. You can see this is that, I think Lynne was talking about this in her earlier presentation, but the before and after is spectacular. And here's the road leading to Sound Beach Avenue. And I'm going to just go to the next slide so you can really see where things get going. So the first daffodils get planted in 2009. Once again, Mary Hull is there, Greenwich Green and Clean, full strong, and lots of volunteers stepped up. And I really should let Pete talk a little bit about this, because he really was the catalyst for this project, got it going. And Pete, do you want to say a little bit about how you got this going and who you recruited?
Well, the key was the support of Bruce Spayman. He said, that's a heck of a good idea. Let's get it started. And so he cooperated with the whole idea of clearing the hill. And we were helped by Mark Weiner, who was then the supervisor in the Binney Park supervisor down in the shed in the south end. And Green and Clean came forward. The town did some donation along with Green and Clean, which is known for doing their daffodil plantings. And we were able to get 2,000 bulbs in that first year. So I'll say that. Nancy, go ahead.
Well, this is just a spectacular pictures showing, the before and after, and you can see bulbs divide and multiply, and they kept adding and adding. And I think all told, there are over 11,000 bulbs planted on this hillside today. And I think, as Pete touched on, what the most wonderful aspect of this project was, we had Bruce Spayman, who gave the nod to do this. And it sort of opened the door for more volunteer projects. It was such a success for the community and for the Parks Department to see we can do volunteer projects like this. So one project leads to another. Right. And here you see additional Eagle Scout projects, some friends I'm sure all of you know, and I will again turn it over to Pete, because he knows these people well and again worked closely on these projects.
You said it. The young man on the left is Eddie Pay, and he was one of 4 Eagle Scouts that I'm aware of that I worked with and had occasion to work with over the years. In the center, you may recognize some of the Garden Club of Old Greenwich ladies who helped so much and have helped. There is one individual who I will not name, but she has been a tiger, and she has been out every year since the beginning from the Old Greenwich Garden Club to plant bulbs. On the right, you see Tad Larrabee. He lives over on Harding Road and loves poison ivy, among other things. And he and I did a lot of the work on the loop trail up in the Hillside Annex. The other gentleman is Hugo Lucivar, and Hugo was a person that I'd gotten to know. He's a mason, he's a great outdoors person, and he's responsible for putting in those second set of steps. This one up on the intersection of Arch Street and Sound Beach. By the way, I'll just close by saying we were somewhat surprised when the telephone company put in that charming gray box, and we ought to have a contest to figure out how to hide the thing. It can't be, it serves the houses up the hill behind the park, and it has to be there. It cannot be placed for some reason up the hill. But if anyone has a bright idea about how to mask that and hide it, then let us know. Nancy? Do you want me to talk about, okay. And here the lights are. This is another Bruce Spayman activity at work. The original, I think they're original, wooden lights were really failing. Many of them didn't work. Some were leaning over. So Bruce got it into his head that they really need to be replaced. And we spent quite a bit of time, a number of people in the village who are the merchants who had an interest in this, coming up with that design for that metal light post you see in the center frame. Once they were in, Bruce came up with another surprise and a great idea, and that was to put the garlands and lights on the lamppost between the first part of December and after the holidays. And you see Lyle Gibbons, who was our representative in the state for many years, helping out on one of those installation activities. And on the right, here's for several years, Boy Scouts did a fundraising project and put in luminaries, which just made the whole northern end of the park magical.
So we are going to come back to what happens to a park if it's left alone. So here you see pictures of storm damage, the silting in, as we all were aware of, and algae bloom. So the message here really is parks are in constant need of attention and help. Were they left alone to their own resources, Binney Park could probably revert back to the swamp it originally was. Here you see Helen Binney Kitchell Natural Park. And many of us would like to say, oh, it's a natural park, its habitat shouldn't just be left alone. But what would happen? Here you see storm damage. It's not like it used to be. You can't just leave open space alone. It needs to be actively managed. Even our passive parks need active management. With the onset of invasive plants, overbrowsing, we've lost understory. So we really need help. Our parks need help. They need a plan. So once again, a master plan was thought of, and it happened. So lots of meetings, lots of input from residents. I'm sure many on this Zoom were part of this, and we have them to thank. So I'm going to let Pete talk about this because he was actively involved in attending all these meetings and how it came to be.
I noticed that Frank O'Gorman is attending and participating as a spectator tonight. And he and I, plus about 7 or 8 other people, pretty much under the leadership of Nancy Kaplan, a resident of Old Greenwich, who at that point was the head of the Park and Recreation Board, came together, and we had meetings to feed ideas to, again, Martha Lyon for the development of the master plan. And she came down and we had these charrettes. You see, this is at the Eastern Greenwich Civic Center. And you can see if you look in the little picture over in the bottom left, Bill Howland sort of helping with some of the moderating of the meeting. It took us a long time. We had a lot of back and forth, and we came up with something that became a template for a major upgrade of Binney.
So born out of this master plan, the park was divided into 13 areas, and each area was to be addressed separately. I just want to pause at this point because as Pete mentioned, we had a catalyst. It was Nancy Kaplan, and she at the time was the chairperson for the Board of Parks and Rec. And I think without her enthusiasm, her support, and her tenacity and vision, a lot of this wouldn't have happened. So I think we should all reflect, and I'm very happy to say that her legacy continues. We were very sad to learn that she had become ill, but we do want to pause and thank her. So the master plan was created, again, thanks to some catalysts, Pete Uhry, of course, being one of them, many of you on this call. But it had to stall because finally, after many requests for the dredging project was going to begin. And so in 2018, the dredging permits were in place and finally completed in 2019. Pete, do you want to add anything to this process of getting to past the dredging?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I was interested to read that the park had pollution, the pond had pollution issues way back in the 30s. And indeed, it was recommended that no one ever sort of swim in it or use it at that time. And because upstream, there are industrial elements that were contributing to the pollution, this has been a problem over the years and was causing part of the delay for the dredging and what was meant to happen in about 2016. It was delayed for a couple of years. But finally, the permits were given and the dredging was done. And then, of course, there's always that question of what do you do with the stuff? And it was hauled away. And we live in this environmental world, which is a good thing. And yet it does have its negative consequences. One of them was the delay of getting started with executing the master plan. And I should add one other element. The money that had been allocated for use for the development, for the executing the master plan, there was a danger of it going back into the general budget if it wasn't used. So this is really what spurred the development then of the Binney Park Advisory Committee.
So here, this slide shows all the committee members. I have to give a little nod to Pete Uhry here because he really went after the Parks and Rec department, said, we've got to get going, we've got to get this money. Let's not lose this money. Let's move forward with a master plan. You've commissioned this master plan. Let's move forward. So interesting to note, Bill Rutherford Jr. So we were so fortunate to have Bill on our team, along with Frank O'Gorman, so 2 landscape architects. We had all the nonprofit stakeholders, representatives from Greenwich Green and Clean, with Mary Hull, of course, and Joanne Messina, Lisa Beebe, Lynne Davenport, as you all know, and Linnea from the Riverside Association, of course, Perrot Library. Also important to note, we started with Bruce Feynman. He was the then superintendent of Parks and Trees. And we transitioned, we had Darren Wigglesworth and then Greg Kramer with the new hire of Greg Kramer. We are so appreciative of their involvement on our committee. They made things happen. They enabled us to do a lot. And we would definitely be remiss if we didn't recognize the leadership of Joe Siciliano, who got it into the capital budget and was supporting us all along. You'll hear more about the roles of Pat Sesto, Al Manelli, and DPW. But again, this is, I think, for Binney, it was the perfect public-private partnership. We were really working well with town staff and residents and stakeholders and all interested people. So just at this point, a little bit of a footnote. Many of you know that there are 2 bridge projects on the table. And so we could not go after many of the things identified in the master plan, but we did get things done. And I'm going to hand over to Pete at this point to talk about some of these things that we have accomplished.
So we decided that we needed to have something that was manageable to achieve, that didn't conflict with the construction work that was being planned for the Wescom Wood and Sound Beach Avenue bridges. And we also believe that the island, which so many people use for wedding shots, and which people walk out on the bridges to look at the turtles and that kind of thing, it was becoming sort of one of the best spots to actually get started. And it was part of the top tier choices. It was one of the top tier choices when the master plan was developed. We also were fortunate to have a donation of close to $30,000 from the Crescetti family, whose long history and involvement with the park prompted them, when they closed their nursery up on the post road, the family elements were in California, but they wanted to have some sort of remembrance in Binney. And so they gave a generous donation, which allowed us to do significant work on the island. And so here you see the skating shed, as it was called, the skating hut, prior to doing anything. And I'm going to let Nancy go back and say what we did.
So this is also just a pre-shot. We basically redid the landscape. I think actually, Pete, you were going to talk a little bit about this picture and how it came to be, but this was the start of using the Crescetti money. We actually brought in outside landscaper, Peter Bruno, and GrowPro, and we had the help of, again, Bill Rutherford. So I think Peter Bruno, Bill Rutherford, and Dr. Greg Kramer as well, all got together and talked about what to do with the landscape. There used to be a very large umbrella pine here that was failing, we felt, and had it grown to maturity, it probably would have taken up this entire area. So that was removed, but some wonderful native plantings were put in its place.
Right.
Pete, do you want to talk more about this before I go on to the next?
Only that I think people who've walked out that will remember those overgrown yew bushes, which had been in those places. And at the bridge, you see in the further in the distance there, as examples of just no change and what happens in things evolving and going along. But that's about all I'll say.
So here you see work done. And we sort of tip our hat now to Al Manelli, because we reached out to Al, recognizing that Parks and Rec would not be responsible for buildings. So we raised the question of the skating hut, and perhaps in an earlier photo you might have seen, but the roof was really failing. And we also were looking at the historic photos and recognized that this chimney was actually not there. So we, in further exploration, we recognized the chimney was never going to be used as it was for skating. It was a liability. It was becoming an attractive nuisance. So Al really stepped up and took on this project. He replaced the roof, got the chimney removed, and we also had outside landscapers and construction people that were involved. And Pete, do you want to add a little bit to this with your?
No, I will suggest you look at the center photograph, because that was Bill Rutherford's idea to open up the view to the north. So when you're there on the island, that you could sort of see up to Perrot Library. And I just think it was a brilliant piece of design work on his part. And what we did looking at the right-hand photograph, which is the same one that you see behind me, what we were able to do is reconstruct a totally deteriorated patio and little area outside there, plant it so that you would have a buffer against going into the lake. And we added 2 benches, and one bench recognizes and honors the contributions of the Crescetti family. The other one recognizes Nancy Kaplan.
And also important to note about Nancy Kaplan, there was a fund that was dedicated in her name, and some of those dollars went to the reinvigoration of this area as well. And hopefully you all will get to see, it's just beautiful transformation of this island. So here, Pete, I'm going to probably let you talk, but I just have to say this is just such a great example of working with the Parks Department. So Pete, why don't you talk about this volunteer day?
Well, here's again, one project leads to another. And so if you do one sort of good thing, like we did the island, we reconstructed the whole thing. And that spurred the idea of, well, let's get plantings going along the edges of the pond, which, if you recall, I mentioned was one of the ideas back in when the Old Greenwich Association did their study in 2005. So here we have was it last June? Two years ago, not this June, but 2 years. We had and we only seen half of the people who volunteered, but we had a 3-hour, let's get this garden area sort of planted, weeded, and cleaned up. And the representatives you see in the picture at the right are not only from the town, but also represent Green and Clean and the Riverside Association and the Old Greenwich Garden Club and the Retired Men's Association and a group of independents. And it was good fun. By the way, we're planning to do one again this summer. There's more gardens along the edge of the pond, and we'll probably need more people than we had.
So I just want to add one point to this. So here you have the Parks Department was working all the heavy equipment. And what was interesting to note is after this great day, and we really got to know the park staff, we had a pizza and soda party at their hut, and they really were inspired. And so here, you know, the island's back in here, and here's this bank. Well, we came back a month later, and they took it upon themselves to mirror the work on the opposite bank. So it's just been an exciting road of volunteers working with staff. Okay, next project.
Well, okay, in the south end of the park, and it was really, I would credit Darren Wigglesworth. Darren is the person who works under Greg Kramer as the field supervisor for all parks in the town. He's a go-getter, terrific guy, very enthusiastic about doing things. And he looked at the patio. We don't see it in its whole stage, but you can sort of get a sense. It was a little bit bigger than the photograph on the right, where the fieldstone or the rock has been placed. But we enlarged the patio. And then Darren said, you know, we ought to have tables so people can sit and watch their kids play games. And why don't we hook up the drinking fountain again, which hadn't been hooked up in some time. So all these things were accomplished, and then some landscaping, new trees were put in. And I should also mention that John Fascione, who is the the supervisor down at the Binney Shed on the other side of this building that you don't see, facing where it faces Arch Street, he came up with the idea of a planting scheme so that when you walk up to the building now, you see landscaping. So it was a real great effort, and I think it's so greatly improved, and it's just too bad we've had the virus, which have kept so many kids from enjoying it. So that's about it, Nancy. I can talk about this is one of my favorite topics. When the dredging was finished, and there was a requirement to have grasses which would allow animals to get in and out of the pond by the wetlands agency. And so the contractual work planted those grasses you see on the left. And I was having a conniption. I could not believe that we were spending all this money to improve Binney Park, and it looked like we had a weed lot up there. So even with mowing in the center photograph, I still was yelling and screaming and making waves, and something happened. Greg Kramer and Peter Gruno and Darren and others came together with the committee, and we've totally re-landscaped that to much more interesting planting. And if you haven't walked it and had a look at it, go do so. It's so much better. And as you drive down Sound Beach Avenue and you look at the park now, including the getting rid of some, you can see it actually in the center photograph, there's a part of a split rail fence which helps you open your view into the park. It's so much more pleasant than what it was. And in a second, we'll give you a lesson that we also learned for doing this. Nancy, move us forward.
Right. Well, so I just want to add on this slide that, yes, this was Pete's, every meeting we heard about the weedy patch, that or the loop trail. So it's important to note that while we were looking at this area, we reached out to Inlands and Wetlands because it was that agency that required the planting back of the buffer. And Pat was great. She came out, walked around, she said, looked at it and said, yes, anything you do might be an improvement, and we will support you as long as it's within the guidelines of Inlands and Wetlands. So I think a lot of people got together. Once again, I'm sure we had Bill Rutherford, we had Greg Kramer, all talking about, what were appropriate wetland plants. Binney is unique in that it's brackish. You will get salt water in, you'll get fresh water in, you'll get sedimentation, and all of these things had to be taken into consideration. And also somewhere on the opposite side of this bank is a cofferdam where it's supposed to be maintained and sediment removed. So a lot had to be taken into consideration to fix Pete's weedy patch, but it really, if you look at it today, it's the night and day. We should have more before and afters on this, I think. So moving on, Pete's other favorite subject, the loop trail.
Yeah, one of the key comments that came out of the master plan was the idea that the north end of the park and the south end of the park were really not connected. And so the idea of a walking path in the south end of the park became part of the master plan. And we invested in making the stone dust path. It has served a number of other positive goals. It got people off of Arch Street. People were walking up Arch Street with strollers and everything. In the picture to the right, if you were to go down behind that backstop there, you come to the playground, and there was no way of sort of getting around. Now you can safely go all the way down to where the little park road comes out, Binney Park Lane, I think it's called. And you can cross and then come on an easterly direction. There's just one part of it we haven't finished, and that has to do with the Wescom Wood Bridge. Because the Department of Public Works is going to be putting equipment close to where the trail would go. again, it was one of those projects Nancy mentioned earlier, we just had to defer the finishing of, but we do plan to do so and hope that that will get carried out. And signs. I can't tell you how long it's been since we've had a sign that says Binney Park, but 2 have been installed. And as a nod to the efforts of the Garden Club of Old Greenwich, which for years has promoted the idea of black and white signs and nothing too fancy in the village of Old Greenwich, and to be a little consistent with what you see with the Perrot Memorial sign, we have 2 well-received black and white signs, and that was another part of our committee effort.
Okay, so where do we go from here? There's work to be done. So our committee took up a lot of things, and we feel we really did tackle quite a lot. But where do we go from here? We think that, for example, the Binney Kitchell Natural Park, we didn't spend a lot of time on. There's opportunity for a friends group, and we hope that perhaps this presentation will help spur that idea on, that concept on. We also think that there's plenty of opportunity for community outreach and community programs. Here is a great slide showing the work of, I believe it was a joint effort between the Tree Conservancy and perhaps the Greenwich Botanical Garden. But they let us tour, and I think they had Greg Kramer talking about trees. And there actually is a tree map as well, and with tree identification, and we will make sure that gets up on the town website if it's not there already. So the point of this is that there's opportunity for people to get involved, either recreationally, volunteering, or with ideas or inspiration. Ideas for future consideration. We had a site walk over at the Minas River Park, and they have a friends group there, a terrific friends group with a great, if you don't know about them, I urge you to go look at their website. I think if you Google Minas River Park, it'll pop up. But it is a park that's pretty much solely maintained through volunteerism. And they have some great signage. We were also impressed by this sign. We're thinking about Helen, Binney, Kitchell here, is that you have a potential for signs with a QR code on it that you could just hold up in this world, this time of technology. I, for one, like to leave my phone at home, but it is a way to find out information about parks. I think Pete put this picture on for me because at every meeting, my thing was, do we really need all those garbage cans? And interestingly, at the Minas River Park, they got rid of them. They said, we have left less trash without trash cans. I had to throw that in. So going ahead, what we know about the future plans for the bridges. And as we mentioned, that did put a stall on some of the priorities mentioned in the Binney Park Master Plan. We were very fortunate. We worked with very well with DPW, and they reached out to us, and we're very thankful for that. One of the ideas that we were able to put in their mind was, maybe you don't need a sidewalk on both sides. Let's try to keep this bridge in keeping as its historic look as possible. They are also they did work with, I believe, again, Bill Rutherford. I almost want to unmute Bill if he's in that audience, he could add here, but, and Greg Kramer to put together a plan for the reading room, because they're going to be using the reading room as a staging area. So again, we feel very fortunate to have strong partnerships with the staff of our town. So again, where we lead off is, let's get going with the Friends of Binney Park. There's work to be done, and a lot of people have a lot they could contribute. The town has a limited budget, and they need our help. And this Binney Park is a great place for private-public partnerships. And Pete, I'm sure you have some things to add that I've missed in these last few slides.
We've talked long and hard, and I think it's time for questions, but please, I've volunteered to take people's names, and if they're interested in participating in a meeting probably in June sometime, where we'll sit down in the park, maybe on the bleachers when there's not a ball game. How's that? And we can talk about establishing a friends group, and it takes work, it takes commitment, and but Binney is certainly worth it. So there's my email address, and I think we can. Do you want to leave can we leave this slide up during the question and answer period, or if not, you can get that. I'm in the phone book. We still have phone books, and you can get a hold of me somehow, and we'll get you involved with the friends. That's it. Let's go to questions and answers.
Okay, thank you, Peter and Nancy. Very much appreciate this wonderful presentation. We do have some questions in the chat room and comments. We'll start with the first one. On Christmas Eve, there used to be a fire going in the fireplace in the skating shed. Does anyone know the history behind that tradition? Who built and tended the fire?
I'm not that old, Nancy.
Okay, so I probably was a town resident then. I do not know the answer to that. I mean, it would have been attended by the Parks Department. When we looked at that fireplace, we thought, wow, maybe this should be resurrected. But it was quickly determined that it was a liability, and a fire would never be set again in that hut. So I wish I knew more about that history. I did skate there as a kid, though, so I probably enjoyed that fire.
Okay, so the next one is concerning the stone dust pathway on the south portion of the park. It does not get used by folks with strollers or children on bikes due to this instability of the surface. Could it be paved to mirror the interior walkways on the north end?
I think you just made Pete Uhry's day.
Right.
He was advocating for a paved surface, and he was voted 10-1, I think.
Right, pretty close to it.
Right, because we, everyone felt it should be a pervious surface in keeping with conservation. I would say that stone dust compacts with time, and the paths around the point are all stone dust, and they do work nicely for strollers. So I guess the message is patience.
Patience, okay. And then there's a question that used to have, the Binney used to have beautiful dogwoods, and they have all apparently passed away. Is there any consideration about replacing them with more hardy flowering trees?
I'll answer that. I don't know that Nancy and I are the qualified ones, but we're sure glad to have Craig Kramer and as our superintendent of parks and trees, and he has done some marvelous things, not only in Binney, but all through town, bringing unusual trees and also ones that really work. My recollection is that the dogwoods, the native dogwoods, had a disease for a long period of time and became a weakened species. And so it may not be that we would be able to recover that, but that's as much as I'll say, because I really don't know anymore.
Okay. Someone made a comment that all town arboretum maps are on the Greenwich Tree Conservancy website. Oh, that must have been Joanne that did that. Our town arboretum is an internationally recognized arboretum and is a partnership between GTC and the town. Someone asked, is there a way to donate a bench to the park in honor of someone? If so, to whom do we contact?
That's a good question. Nancy, do you
So
want
yes, so that is handled through Parks and Recreation. And so I believe we would start with Darren and identify, he would help us identify site location. I know having sat, sit on the board of Parks and Rec, there is now caution of too much cluttering of benches. So I think mostly at Todd's point. I think there are places, I think there are opportunities. I think as we look to bring a path around towards the south end, there are potential sites for a bench. So love the idea of someone that would like to donate a bench. But I think if they want to reach out, we've got Pete Uhry's email up. We'll make sure we get it through the right channels.
Okay. So this is another one. There's one that I'm not quite sure pertains to this conversation, but I'll come back at the end if there's time. It says in a recent athletic field study, the recommendation for Binney Park was to add 90 space parking lot. And apparently they'll not only convert some of the athletic field. Could you talk to that possibly?
I guess I'll take that on since I serve on the Board of Parks and Rec. This was a study that was done. Nothing is moving forward. It was just, they're throwing out ideas of potential. It's not something that was part of our charge. I'll always go back to our Binney Park Committee was charged with implementing the master plan. That was not part of the plan, so it wasn't something that we took up. But as I understand it, this field study report is just a report that was created to get people to think out of the box, if I heard them, basically what are opportunities. So, but it's not getting acted on. I think that the big message is nothing's getting acted on, and it won't without proper input.
Okay. There's a compliment about the patio on the island on your photo, Pete, how beautiful it is. There's also discussion of installing new benches along the left-hand side of the stream by the athletic field. Is that going ahead? There's concern about this place regularly flooding, and could that be taken into consideration?
If you want me to take that on. Okay, so yes, this is, we will both. I see Pete did all the talking, so he's letting me put me in the hot spot, right? So yes, that is, everyone has to remember this was a swamp, and with no doubt we've got increased flooding, and all of these things are taken in consideration. It impacts what we can plant and what we can't plant. Again, Greg Kramer gives a lot of thought to salt tolerant planting. So the path that will go there will have to be able to withstand flooding. Binney floods. So any benches that would go there would definitely need to be, take that into consideration. High ground, right?
Okay, so, but right now there's only been discussion. There's nothing actually happening with the benches. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure if this pertains, but what is planned for the Sound Beach Bridge?
The Sound Beach Avenue.
It just says Sound Beach Bridge. I'm not quite sure what that is.
It's probably that one by Perrot.
So I would refer people to the DPW website. They've done a public meeting. There's a pretty good presentation. And again, that was beyond the scope of our charge. So, but the DPW website has a lot of information on their bridges. And if you're not finding what you're looking for, please feel free to reach out to us and contact us.
Okay. There's one other question that's actually not on the chat. It was on an email that I received. It says, over the last few months, more and more people have been driving the wrong way around the one-way road by the athletics field. There's little signage to indicate that it is a one-way street, and the arrows have worn off the road. There's comment about it being dangerous with large trucks. I don't know, but anyway, is there anything to be to addressing the signage to improve this issue?
I'll answer that simply that it certainly is not something that our committee would have gotten involved in. However, whoever brought that question up has brought up a very serious safety thing, and I hope that they should first of all address it to the Department of Public Works. I would also address it to Greg Kramer, since it also is in his domain, in the parks domain, to try and get that. Certainly better signage might help eliminate some of that incorrect driving.
Okay. And is there a schedule for the Wescom Wood Bridge replacement?
You want to
Again, that would be on the, maybe Pete, of dates, but it's in the DPW website.
Okay.
My understanding is that Sound Beach will be accomplished first. That Wescom Wood is, we're looking at 2023, and I'm sort of making that up because I haven't had a direct conversation with DPW in more than a year on the topic. So they're still in the preliminary stages, but they do plan to do it.
Okay. So the last question that I'm not sure how it relates, but perhaps you could address it is, do you have any communication with Stanford regarding coordinating Ladden's Rock Sanctuary with Rosa Hartman Park?
That's good. You want to answer it, or you want to?
We'll speak at the same time.
One of the things that I have had a long-term dream about is if you start in the south end of Binney Park, down near the railroad bridge, and you were to walk all the way up to Rosa Hartman, up near where Sportsplex is, and into that area, you'd be going almost a mile. And the links are there with the exception of about 50 yards where you come out of Binney Kitchell Natural Park on the east end, and then have to sort of navigate along that terrible road that goes up by West-East Storage and Sportsplex. There's a little strip there. If you get through that, you suddenly enter Ladden's Rock, and then Ladden's Rock connects to, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, connects to Rosa Hartman, and Rosa Hartman in Stanford connects with Ladden's Rock in Old Greenwich. So that I think in the long term, it's been discussed with Greg Kramer and Darren Wigglesworth and has been kicked around for many years. There's hope that maybe we could really have sort of a usable natural trail, which would probably be 1.5 miles right in the center of Old Greenwich. It's a terrific sort of a thing to think about.
And I'll just add my conservation hat. You know, with something like this, you're creating a greenway, if you will. And greenways are so important for habitat, wildlife corridors, and so it would be a remarkable thing. I think I maybe have hopes for Dr. Greg Kramer, because he has been reaching out to folks in Stanford, and I think we have now a contact in Stanford. So, you know, we maybe we could find that loop and connection.
Well, Dr. Kramer is on the talk tonight. So he just said one-way concern going the wrong way noted. Thank you. So be aware of that. And so that's a good thing. And that is the end of all the questions that we have tonight that I see. So Nancy and Peter, thank you so much for a wonderful sharing experience on the Binney Park Advisory Committee. It was very informative and a lot of fun to learn about this. And as everybody should know, Peter left his email address up, so you can reach out to him to see if you can become involved on Friends of Binney Park.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And it takes a village. So it was great to be part of this committee, but it really was a huge group effort. And thank you, Perrot Library, for hosting this, and Lynn somehow roping me into this. I was terrified.
Thank you, Pete and Nancy. I really appreciate your helping us out, because Martina had these wonderful ideas of keeping the garden club tuned into the community under this COVID restriction. And we really appreciate your helping us out in this, because it was a terrific presentation. It was great.
Okay. Thank you all. I think we'll be signing off. And I will be closing the meeting. Thanks for attending, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.